It happened with a supersonic boom. Last weekend, a U.S. fighter jet shot down a Chinese spy balloon off the Atlantic coast, just off the coast of South Carolina. We don't know much more than that. It was an apparent case of shoot first, ask questions later. So what about that balloon? And why did the Pentagon just confirm that there have been other balloons sent from China? Now, before this happened, Beijing and Washington said that they wanted to mend tattered relations. Was that true? Or was it just a lot of hot air? I'm Brent Goff in Berlin. This is The Day.
What began as a spy balloon has become a trial balloon.
And I commend President Biden's leadership.
And unfortunately, the president failed that test.
The unintended entry of the airship into U.S. airspace is an isolated and accidental incident.
Order the Pentagon to shoot it down on Wednesday as soon as possible.
We sent a clear message to China that this is not acceptable.
This is unacceptable and irresponsible behavior.
The president was paralyzed for an entire week by a balloon.
A Chinese spy balloon shot down by the U.S. and the pop heard from Washington all the way to Beijing. Until a few days ago, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's plans were to be in China today for the first visit by a top U.S. official since before the pandemic. Well, that trip was canceled due to what is now being called Balloon Gate. Over the weekend, the U.S. shot down what it says was a Chinese spy balloon. Beijing has called the response irresponsible, and it says that the U.S. shot down a weather balloon. A U.S. fighter jet downed the balloon over the Atlantic Ocean just off the coast of South Carolina on Saturday after the balloon had drifted for several days all the way across North America. Some Republicans in Washington have criticized U.S. President Biden for not taking action sooner. On the other side of the Pacific, Beijing has been trying to play down this incident and is accusing Washington of overreacting.
As far as I know, it's not the first time a scientific research balloon lost control internationally. The unintended entry of the airship into U.S. airspace is an isolated and accidental incident, but it tested the U.S.'s sincerity in maintaining China-U.S. ties and its crisis management. We hope the U.S. will work with China to avoid miscalculations and damaging relations.
Well, now that the balloon has been shot down, what next for China and the United States? I'm joined tonight by Michael Herson. He's head of China research with 22V Research in New York City, and by Mark Montgomery. He's with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He joins me from Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, to both of you, welcome. It's good to have you on the program. Michael, let me start with you. Help us understand here what China was trying to do. What did we see here in this balloon that was moving across North America?
Well, I think that's actually the hardest part here, is to determine China's intentions. It's always difficult to speculate what's happening within China's system. I think based on the comments from U.S. defense officials, I doubt that it was a weather balloon. But I also would be skeptical that this was an intentionally provocative act on the Chinese side. Surely China's military knew, where the balloon was going and what the goal was. But I don't think that China's leadership wanted to scuttle the trip or wanted events to unfold as they have.
Mark, what do you think? I mean, to allow, let's say, if we believe the Pentagon, this is a spy balloon, for Beijing to allow it to cross into the United States, I mean, that is quite the bold move for Beijing to make.
Well, first, thank you for having me, and I do agree with Michael that I tend to think that it's probably more than a weather balloon, based on the U.S. Department of Defense's strong indications and comments that it was a surveillance balloon. Why China would do this, I'm also befuddled. There is not a logical reason. It was totally brazen to run something at 60 to 70,000 feet altitude. That's clearly within our territorial airspace. It is not something that's done routinely. People tend to think that we're flying aircraft over China or Russia. We do not do that. the last time we had a weather incident problem, back in 1960 with Gary Power's U-2, that's about when we ended these kind of overflights with aircraft over a major power like China or Russia. So we don't do this. Why they would do it back at us is a real question to understand. And I tend to think it can't have been decided at the very highest levels of the Chinese Communist Party, because the risk return on this was backwards.
Yeah, I want to talk about that in just a moment, about the communication that is or is not taking place within the Communist Party in China. But first, though, I'd like for you gentlemen to take a listen to what what people in China are saying about what happened. Take a listen.
I think this is a bit of an embarrassing moment for the Americans, because the U.S. Air Force, which prides itself on being the world's leading air force, surprisingly did not solve this civilian aircraft problem quickly. They dragged it out for 3 days. From my perspective, when I think about it, if it were a U.S. balloon which had floated to China, we may take similar measures. From a personal point of view, it's probably not a big deal. It's understandable. Considering that the current international situation is very tense, I think I can understand the reaction from the United States. They're making a big fuss about this incident. It doesn't do any good. It doesn't serve world peace.
So, Michael, making a big fuss over this, I mean, that's the way Beijing wants the world to see this. If this balloon had been sent to collect weather data, I mean, and if it had gone off course, as they're claiming, how do we read the fact that no one, as far as we know from the Chinese government, from Beijing, attempted to alert the Americans?
Right. That is one of the questions here, if this were a weather balloon. But what I think is most interesting about the interviews that you just played and the comments is that, I think on the whole, this did not generate a very intense reaction domestically within China, because after all, it is the loss of one balloon. Why that matters is that I think this whole episode shows the risks to the relationship if we do have a more serious accident or miscalculation. And in particular, I'm worried about a situation where you have both the U.S. domestic public and the Chinese domestic public up in arms. I don't think we had that this time. We had certainly the U.S. public, or at least a portion of it, and of course the media fascinated by this. But I think we've kind of dodged a bullet, so to speak, by the fact that for China, this is not as much of a big deal. But another crisis, for example, over Taiwan, could put us in a very different dynamic.
And Mark, what about the role of the U.S. president here? I mean, you could pose the question, why not pick up the phone and call President Xi and demand an explanation at the beginning of this, instead of letting it, cross North America out before you say, okay, go and shoot it down? Why not just pick up the phone and call Beijing and say what's going on?
So I'd separate those. I think you're absolutely right that, an opportunity to talk with Xi was missed here, because we certainly had the predicate for a conversation. What's this balloon doing here? In terms of how the president and the military handled this, this is the right move. I mean, you don't shoot this down over U.S. Territory, because of the even limited and small risk of fracture of ground damage. They handled this exactly appropriately, but the part that's not right is the initial response in missing that opportunity to talk to China, and then also not alerting the American public for about 5 days of it. It popped over the top of Montana is the first we see it, when clearly it had been transiting U.S. airspace for about 4 days before that.
And Mark, this apparently is not the first time that Chinese spy balloons have been spotted over U.S. territory. I mean, that's what we're just learning of now. Is that something that the public should be alarmed by, or how do you read that?
So I'm a retired U.S. Navy admiral, spent most of his time in the Pacific, and I'll tell you that we routinely, saw surveillance balloons and surveillance issues. They didn't pass over U.S. territory routinely, but certainly the idea that one may have passed over Guam or the Aleutians, the island chain off of Alaska, or the Hawaiian island chain would not have been uncommon. But that also wouldn't have incited this kind of press response. That's why there's this confusion, I think, between the Trump administration and Biden administration officials. The previous passes were not like a large balloon, laboriously passing over Montana, Missouri, and exiting in South Carolina.
Yeah. Let me ask both of you, Michael, start with you. This balancing act that the United States and China are engaged in right now, you know, we're talking about two adversaries, militarily possible. At the same time, we're talking about the world's two largest economies that are interdependent. I mean, almost every facet of the economies of both countries are married to each other. The reaction that we saw from Washington and from Beijing, does that tell us that these countries, are they perfecting the balance act, or are they actually losing their grip here?
I think we should be worried about the grip that the two countries have. And I think the reason for that is we have a mix of intense mutual distrust and also some very difficult domestic politics in both countries. And if you look back at the relationship, you know, there have been two near crises in the past. Once when the U.S. accidentally bombed China's embassy in Belgrade in 1999. And then, of course, the collision between a U.S. Plane and Chinese military plane off the coast of Hainan in 2001. Both of those were successfully diffused. The question is, could we diffuse that kind of episode in this kind of political climate? And I think, you know, we have to be worried, given just the reaction that we've seen from, from this event. So I do worry about what this means in terms of our ability to avoid a spiral between the two sides if there's another incident, or an accident or miscalculation.
Mark, what do you say? I mean, we know that for now there's no trip to China for the U.S. Secretary of State. Plans to improve relations between these two countries that obviously still need each other. Where are we?
Well, I do think we're going to have a challenge. I think broadly the United States has been an absent caretaker in the Pacific for the last 23 years while we've been heavily involved in the Middle East. Our focus is finally returning after some aborted attempts in the Obama and Trump administrations. I think President Biden's team is becoming more focused on the Pacific. The military is more focused on the Pacific. Our economic leadership's more focused on this relationship and whether there's fair practices in our trade with China. And that is going to pressurize the relationship. I think I don't want to say it was a free pass, but the Chinese got a pretty limited hall pass for the last 20 years. And now the United States is saying, wait, this is the appropriate way this is the transparency we expect to see. This is the rules-based system we're advocating for. And we're in strong disagreement with China on a lot of basic principles. So I do think there'll be a lot more disagreement and competition and crises over the next decade.
Gentlemen, to both of you, we appreciate excellent analysis tonight. Michael Herson with the 22V Research and Mark Montgomery with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. To both of you, thank you.
Thank you.